There is something about faith that many people misunderstand. Most people imagine that if someone loses their faith, it must happen because of something dramatic. A tragedy, a betrayal, a crisis so painful that it shakes everything they believed. But in reality, that is rarely how faith disappears. For most people, faith does not collapse in a single moment. It fades slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And that is what makes it so dangerous. Because when something breaks suddenly, you notice it immediately. If a glass shatters on the floor, everyone hears it. If a storm destroys a house, the damage is obvious. But faith usually does not break that way. Instead, it erodes, little by little, day by day, until one day, someone looks back and realizes that something they once held tightly has slowly slipped away. Think about someone who once believed deeply, someone who used to pray regularly, someone who once felt close to God. They didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to abandon their faith. That's not how it usually happens. Instead, the changes begin quietly. Maybe they stop praying as often, not intentionally, just because life becomes busy, work becomes demanding, responsibilities pile up, and suddenly the quiet moments they once spent with God begin disappearing. At first, it feels harmless. Skipping one prayer doesn't seem like a big deal. Missing a day of reflection doesn't seem important. But small changes, when repeated over time, begin shaping the direction of a person's life. Then something else happens. Questions begin appearing. Questions that once seemed easy to answer suddenly feel more complicated. Why does God allow certain things to happen? Why do prayers sometimes feel unanswered? Why do difficult seasons last longer than expected? Questions themselves are not the enemy of faith. In fact, many people grow stronger in their faith by exploring difficult questions honestly. But when questions remain unspoken, when they stay hidden inside someone's mind without guidance or conversation, they can begin turning into something else. Doubt. And doubt, when it grows quietly in isolation, can slowly weaken even strong beliefs. But perhaps the most surprising thing about fading faith is how ordinary the process can feel. There are rarely warning signs that feel dramatic. Life simply becomes full. Schedules become crowded. Attention shifts toward other priorities. Days pass, then weeks, then months, and slowly, something that once felt central in a person's life becomes something distant, something they rarely think about anymore. It is not always rebellion. It is not always rejection. Sometimes it is simply neglect. And neglect, over time, can have powerful consequences. Imagine a small plant that sits by a window. At first, it is healthy and strong. But if it stops receiving water, the change does not happen immediately. For a while, the plant still looks alive, still standing, still green. But little by little, something begins changing beneath the surface. The leaves lose their strength, the roots weaken, and eventually the plant begins to fade. Not because it was violently destroyed, but because it was slowly starved. Faith can be very similar. It thrives when it is nourished, when people spend time in prayer, when they reflect on spiritual truths, when they surround themselves with others who share and strengthen their beliefs. But when those things slowly disappear, faith can begin losing its strength without the person realizing it. And the most surprising part is this. Many people who experience this process do not even notice it happening. They still consider themselves believers. They still carry the language of faith. But the passion they once had begins fading. The connection they once felt becomes distant. Until eventually they find themselves wondering why their faith no longer feels the way it once did. If that has ever happened to you, you are not alone. Many people experience seasons where their faith feels weaker than it once was. And often the reason is not what they think. It is not always a lack of belief. It is often the quiet influence of small forces that slowly pull a person away from the center of their faith. Forces that are easy to overlook. Forces that rarely appear dramatic. But forces that, over time, can reshape a person's spiritual life. In this message, we are going to explore 3 of the most powerful forces that quietly destroy faith. Not overnight, not through loud rebellion, but through subtle patterns that slowly weaken what once felt strong. These are things many people experience without realizing their impact. And once you understand them, you may begin seeing your own spiritual life more clearly. Because sometimes the difference between a fading faith and a growing one is not about believing more. It is about recognizing the quiet things that may be slowly pulling your faith apart. And once you recognize them, you can begin protecting the faith that matters so deeply to you. Let's begin with the first one, something so common in modern life that many people never even consider its impact on their spiritual lives. How faith slowly begins to fade. One of the most important things to understand about faith is that it rarely disappears suddenly. Most people assume that if someone loses their faith, there must have been a dramatic reason, a crisis, a painful event, a moment that shattered everything they believed. But the truth is often much quieter than that. Faith usually fades slowly. So slowly, in fact, that many people do not notice the change until much later. It begins with small shifts, tiny adjustments in daily life that seem harmless at first. Maybe someone becomes busier than usual. Work demands more attention. Family responsibilities increase. Schedules fill up with obligations and distractions. At first, nothing feels wrong. Life simply feels full. But somewhere in the middle of that fullness, something subtle begins to change. The time that was once reserved for prayer becomes shorter. Then sometimes it disappears altogether. The quiet moments of reflection that once felt meaningful are replaced by scrolling through a phone or rushing to the next task. Days pass, then weeks, and gradually, the spiritual habits that once strengthened a person's faith begin slipping away. Not because they rejected faith, not because they intentionally walked away, but because life became crowded. And when life becomes crowded, the quiet things are usually the first to disappear. Faith often lives in those quiet spaces, in moments of stillness, in reflection, in prayer. When those spaces vanish, faith begins losing the environment where it once grew. But the change is so gradual that it rarely feels alarming. Skipping a moment of prayer does not feel dangerous. Missing a day of spiritual reflection does not seem like a big deal. Each individual moment appears small, but the accumulation of those small moments begins shaping the direction of a person's life. Think about how habits work in other areas. If someone stops exercising for one day, nothing dramatic happens. If they skip 2 days, the impact still seems minor. But if weeks pass without movement, the body slowly begins losing strength. Energy decreases. Endurance fades. The change did not happen instantly. It happened through small decisions repeated over time. Faith works in a very similar way. It grows through consistent nourishment, through small practices that keep the heart connected to something greater. Prayer, reflection, community, spiritual learning. When these practices remain part of daily life, faith tends to remain strong. But when they begin disappearing, faith slowly becomes weaker. Another reason this process can be difficult to recognize is that outward appearances may not change immediately. Someone may still attend church. They may still identify as a believer. They may still speak about faith in familiar ways. But internally, something feels different. The connection they once felt may begin fading. The excitement they once had about spiritual growth becomes less intense. And eventually, faith begins feeling more like a memory than a living relationship. At this point, some people start asking themselves quiet questions. Why does faith not feel the way it once did? Why does prayer feel harder than it used to? Why does spiritual life feel distant? The answer is rarely simple, but often it traces back to something subtle, the slow erosion of spiritual attention. Human attention is powerful. Whatever we focus on regularly becomes stronger in our lives. Whatever we neglect tends to fade. When attention shifts away from spiritual life for long periods of time, faith can slowly lose its influence. This does not mean someone has stopped believing entirely, but belief without attention gradually weakens. Imagine a close friendship. If two people stop talking regularly, their relationship does not immediately disappear. But over time, distance begins growing between them. Conversations become less frequent. Shared experiences fade. And eventually, the connection that once felt natural becomes unfamiliar. Faith can experience the same kind of distance, not because God moves away, but because human attention moves elsewhere. Modern life makes this process even easier. Never before have people lived in a world with so many distractions competing for their attention. Phones, notifications, social media, news, entertainment, endless streams of information that constantly demand focus. Every day, the mind is pulled in dozens of directions. And when attention becomes fragmented, spiritual awareness often becomes quieter. Faith requires space to breathe. It grows when people step away from constant noise and reconnect with deeper truths. But when life becomes filled with constant stimulation, those deeper moments can disappear. And when that happens, faith slowly loses its foundation. This is why the fading of faith is rarely dramatic. There is no loud moment where someone declares that they no longer believe. Instead, it often happens through neglect, through the quiet replacement of spiritual practices with endless distractions, through the slow loss of attention toward the things that once nourished the soul. Yet understanding this process is incredibly important, because when someone recognizes how faith fades, they also realize something hopeful. If faith can weaken through neglect, it can also grow through intentional care. The same small habits that once strengthened faith can be rebuilt. Moments of prayer can return. Reflection can become part of daily life again. Connection with God can grow stronger once more. But before rebuilding faith, it is important to understand the forces that slowly pull people away from it. And one of the most powerful forces in modern life is something many people experience every single day without realizing its spiritual impact. It is not hostility toward faith. It is not open rejection of belief. It is something far more common. Something that quietly fills every moment of modern life. Distraction. Thing number one, constant distraction. One of the most powerful forces quietly weakening faith today is not something most people expect. It is not persecution. It is not open hostility toward belief. It is not even strong arguments against faith. Instead, it is something far more subtle. Something that fills modern life almost every moment of the day. Distraction. Distraction has become so normal that many people rarely question its impact. Phones buzz constantly. Notifications appear every few minutes. Social media feeds never end. News updates arrive all day long. Videos autoplay. Messages demand quick responses. Attention is pulled in dozens of directions at once. For many people, silence has become rare. Moments of stillness almost feel uncomfortable. The mind becomes used to constant stimulation. Always scrolling, always watching, always consuming something new. At first glance, this might not seem connected to faith. But when you look deeper, the connection becomes clear. Faith grows in quiet places. It grows in moments when the mind slows down, when someone pauses long enough to reflect, when they sit in prayer, when they listen for something deeper than the noise of daily life. But distraction slowly removes those quiet spaces. Imagine waking up in the morning. Instead of beginning the day with reflection or prayer, the first instinct is to reach for a phone. Within seconds, the mind is filled with information, messages, news, entertainment. Before the day even begins, attention has already been captured by dozens of things unrelated to spiritual life. Then the day continues. Work demands focus. Schedules fill up quickly. Responsibilities pile up. During short breaks, the mind seeks quick stimulation again. Another scroll, another video, another distraction. By the time evening arrives, the mind is exhausted. And when someone finally has a moment to slow down, it feels easier to watch something relaxing than to sit quietly in reflection. None of these actions seem harmful on their own. Checking a phone is not wrong. Watching something entertaining is not sinful. But when these habits dominate daily life, something important begins disappearing. The quiet space where faith once grew. Think about some of the most meaningful spiritual moments people experience. They often happen in silence, in prayer, in reflection, in moments where the mind is not overwhelmed by endless noise. But when life becomes filled with constant stimulation, those moments become rare. And when they become rare, faith begins losing the environment where it thrives. This is one of the reasons why many people feel spiritually distant today, even though they still believe. Their belief has not disappeared, but their attention has been pulled somewhere else. Attention is powerful. Whatever captures it consistently begins shaping the direction of a person's heart. If attention is constantly focused on material success, that becomes the center of life. If attention is constantly focused on entertainment, entertainment becomes the primary source of emotional satisfaction. If attention rarely focuses on spiritual truth, faith slowly becomes weaker. Not because it was attacked, but because it was neglected. In many ways, distraction works like a slow fog that settles over spiritual awareness. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no loud rejection of belief. Instead, faith slowly becomes less present in daily life, less influential in decision-making, less central in how someone sees the world. Eventually, people may begin feeling something strange. They still consider themselves believers, but their spiritual life feels distant. Prayer feels harder. Scripture feels less engaging. Faith no longer feels as alive as it once did. Often, the cause is not doubt. It is distraction. Their mind has been trained to move quickly from one stimulus to the next. Stillness feels unfamiliar. Reflection feels difficult. And without reflection, spiritual awareness becomes weaker. This is why many spiritual traditions emphasize silence. Not because silence is magical, but because silence creates the space where deeper awareness can return. When someone steps away from constant noise, something interesting begins happening. The mind slows down. Thoughts become clearer. Emotions become easier to understand. And spiritual awareness begins reappearing. But in a world built on constant stimulation, silence requires intentional effort. It requires choosing moments where devices are set aside. Moments where the mind is allowed to breathe. Moments where prayer becomes possible again. Without those moments, distraction quietly continues its work. It slowly replaces spiritual attention with endless activity. And eventually, faith begins fading simply because it is no longer receiving attention. Yet there is an important truth hidden inside this challenge. If distraction weakens faith by taking attention away, then the opposite is also true. Attention can rebuild faith. When someone begins intentionally creating space again, space for prayer, reflection, and spiritual focus, faith often begins growing stronger. Not instantly, but gradually, just like it once faded gradually. The key is recognizing the pattern. Because once someone sees how distraction shapes their spiritual life, they gain the power to change it. But distraction is only the first force that can quietly weaken faith. There is another force that can be even more dangerous. Because unlike distraction, it operates inside a person's thoughts. It often begins with simple questions. Questions that seem harmless at first. But if they remain unanswered for too long, they can slowly grow into something that quietly shakes the foundation of belief. Thing number 2, silent doubt. Doubt is one of the most misunderstood parts of faith. Many people believe that if someone experiences doubt, it means their faith is weak. They imagine that strong believers never question anything, never struggle with uncertainty, never wrestle with difficult thoughts about God, life, or the meaning of suffering. But the reality is very different. Doubt itself is not the enemy of faith. In fact, many people develop a deeper and stronger faith because they are willing to ask difficult questions. Throughout history, countless believers have wrestled with uncertainty. They have asked questions about pain, justice, suffering, and the mysteries of God's plan. And through that struggle, their understanding of faith became richer and more meaningful. The real danger is not doubt itself. The real danger is silent doubt. Silent doubt is what happens when someone begins questioning things internally but never talks about it. They keep the questions inside. They never share their thoughts with someone they trust. They never seek wisdom or guidance. They never allow those questions to be explored honestly. Instead, the questions remain alone inside their mind. At first, the doubts may feel small. Maybe something happened that did not make sense. Maybe a prayer felt unanswered. Maybe someone witnessed suffering that seemed unfair. Maybe they heard arguments that challenged their beliefs. The questions begin quietly. Why did this happen? Why would God allow this? Why does life sometimes feel so difficult? These questions are not unusual. They are part of the human experience. But when someone feels that they are not allowed to ask these questions, something begins to change. Instead of bringing their doubts into the light, they hide them. They begin pretending that everything is fine. They continue speaking the language of faith on the outside. But internally, the questions remain unresolved. Over time, those unresolved questions can grow. The mind returns to them again and again. Without guidance, the imagination begins filling the gaps. Assumptions replace understanding. And slowly, what began as a simple question can transform into deeper uncertainty. Silent doubt often grows stronger in isolation. When someone believes they are the only person struggling with certain thoughts, the weight of those thoughts becomes heavier. They may begin thinking something is wrong with them. They may feel guilty for even having questions. They may worry that expressing those doubts will lead to judgment or rejection. So they stay silent. But silence rarely resolves inner conflict. Instead, it allows doubt to grow in the background. Think about how a small crack in a wall behaves. At first, it is barely noticeable. just a thin line, easy to ignore. But if that crack remains unattended for years, it slowly expands. Pressure builds. Eventually, the structure itself becomes unstable. Silent doubt can work the same way. Not because doubt is inherently destructive, but because unresolved questions accumulate. They slowly reshape the way someone thinks about faith. Without conversation, without learning, without reflection, those questions remain incomplete. Eventually, a person may begin feeling disconnected from beliefs they once held confidently. They might not even be able to explain exactly when that change happened. They simply notice that faith no longer feels as certain as it once did. And because they never expressed those questions openly, they may not even realize how many of their doubts could have been addressed. Many spiritual leaders throughout history have emphasized the importance of honest questioning. Faith does not require pretending that life is simple. It does not require ignoring difficult realities. True faith often grows stronger when people explore their questions with humility and sincerity. But silent doubt removes that possibility. It traps questions inside a person's mind where they slowly multiply without resolution. This is why community can play such an important role in spiritual life. When people share their struggles with others who understand faith, something powerful happens. They realize they are not alone. Many of the questions they thought were unique are actually common experiences. Other believers have wrestled with similar thoughts. They have asked the same questions. And through conversation, wisdom begins emerging. Sometimes answers appear. Other times understanding grows even when the answers remain mysterious. But in both cases, doubt loses its power to isolate. Instead of growing in silence, it becomes part of a journey toward deeper understanding. Another important step is recognizing that faith is not the absence of questions. Faith often means choosing trust even while questions exist. Life contains mysteries that human understanding cannot fully explain. Even the most thoughtful believers acknowledge that some aspects of God's plans remain beyond human comprehension. But silent doubt can convince people that uncertainty must mean failure. It whispers that questions automatically destroy belief. That is simply not true. Questions, when explored honestly, often lead to growth. But when questions are buried and ignored, they slowly create distance. Distance between a person and the faith they once held. If you have ever experienced silent doubt, you are not alone. Many people go through seasons where certain aspects of their faith feel uncertain. The important thing is not pretending those questions do not exist. The important thing is bringing them into the light, talking about them, seeking wisdom, exploring them with humility and patience. Because when doubts are faced honestly, they often lose their ability to quietly weaken faith. Instead, they become stepping stones toward a deeper and more mature understanding of belief. But silent doubt is only one of the forces that can quietly destroy faith. There is another force that may be even more powerful, because it removes something every believer needs in order for faith to grow: encouragement, support, connection. Thing number 3, spiritual isolation. There is a powerful truth about faith that many people do not realize until much later in life. Faith was never meant to grow alone. From the very beginning, spiritual life has always been connected to community. People encouraging one another, learning together, supporting each other through difficult seasons. Yet one of the most common ways faith quietly weakens is through something that often feels completely normal: isolation. Not necessarily physical isolation. A person can be surrounded by people every day and still experience spiritual isolation. They may work with others, spend time with family, interact constantly with friends or colleagues. But when it comes to their spiritual life, they are completely alone. No conversations about faith, no shared encouragement, no one asking deeper questions about what they believe or how they are growing spiritually. At first, this might not seem like a serious problem. Many people believe faith is something purely personal, something that exists only between themselves and God. In one sense, that is true. Faith is deeply personal, but it was never designed to be completely private. Human beings are shaped by the people around them. We influence each other constantly. The values we hold, the habits we develop, and the beliefs we strengthen are often shaped by the communities we belong to. Think about how motivation works in other areas of life. Someone trying to stay physically healthy often finds it easier when they exercise with others. Someone learning a new skill improves faster when they are surrounded by people pursuing the same goal. Encouragement multiplies motivation. Shared effort builds strength. Faith works in a similar way. When believers share their experiences, support one another, and learn together, faith often becomes stronger. But when someone becomes spiritually isolated, something subtle begins to happen. Their inner struggles grow louder. Without encouragement from others, doubts can feel heavier. Without shared worship or reflection, spiritual practices become easier to neglect. Without meaningful conversation about faith, spiritual growth begins slowing down. And the most surprising part is that many people do not even realize this is happening. Isolation often begins gradually. Maybe someone becomes busy with work. Their schedule changes. They stop attending gatherings where faith was once discussed. They tell themselves it is temporary, just a short break. But weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. And slowly, the connections that once supported their faith fade away. Without realizing it, their spiritual life becomes something they carry completely alone. When someone carries faith alone for too long, discouragement can begin creeping in. Because life inevitably brings difficult seasons. Moments of confusion. Moments of pain. Moments where faith feels harder to hold on to. During those moments, encouragement from others can make a powerful difference. A conversation. A shared story. A reminder that someone else has walked through similar struggles. These small interactions often strengthen faith in ways people rarely notice. But when isolation removes those interactions, something changes. Instead of hearing encouragement, a person hears only their own thoughts. Instead of shared hope, they face struggles alone. And over time, that loneliness can slowly weaken the foundation of their faith. Another effect of isolation is that perspective becomes limited. When people only process spiritual questions inside their own minds, their understanding remains narrow. But when believers learn together, they discover insights they may never have considered on their own. Someone else's experience can illuminate a truth that once seemed confusing. Someone else's story can restore hope during a difficult season. Spiritual community often provides a wider view of faith. It reminds people that belief is not just an individual experience, but part of a much larger story. When isolation removes that perspective, faith can begin feeling smaller, less alive, less connected to something greater. This is one of the reasons many people who drift away from faith first drift away from community. The two are deeply connected. When someone becomes disconnected from other believers, their faith may continue for a while. But without encouragement, without shared experiences, without accountability, it becomes harder to maintain the same level of spiritual strength. And just like the other forces we have discussed, this process usually happens quietly. No dramatic decision. No sudden rejection of belief. Just a gradual drifting apart. A slow separation from the relationships that once supported faith. Until one day a person realizes they have been carrying their spiritual life alone for a very long time. But here is the hopeful truth. Isolation does not have to be permanent. Human connection can be rebuilt. Community can be rediscovered. Sometimes all it takes is a simple step. A conversation. A willingness to reconnect with others who share the same desire for spiritual growth. Faith often becomes stronger the moment someone realizes they do not have to walk the journey alone. Because faith was never designed to survive in isolation. It thrives in encouragement. It grows through shared experiences. And it becomes resilient when believers support one another through the challenges of life. Now that we have explored the three quiet forces that can slowly weaken faith, distraction, silent doubt, and spiritual isolation, it is important to ask an important question. If these things can quietly destroy faith, how can someone protect their faith from them? How to protect and strengthen your faith. After understanding the quiet forces that can slowly weaken faith, an important question naturally appears. If distraction, silent doubt, and spiritual isolation can gradually pull someone away from their faith, how can a person protect it? How can someone keep their faith strong in a world that constantly pulls their attention in other directions? The encouraging truth is this. Faith is not something fragile that disappears the moment life becomes difficult. Faith can remain strong. But like anything meaningful in life, it must be nurtured, protected, strengthened intentionally. And often, the way faith grows stronger is not through dramatic changes, but through simple practices repeated consistently over time. Small actions that keep the heart connected to what truly matters. One of the most powerful ways to protect faith is by creating space for quiet connection with God. In a world filled with constant noise, silence has become incredibly valuable. When someone chooses to step away from distractions, even for a short time, something powerful happens. The mind slows down, thoughts become clearer, and spiritual awareness begins returning. Prayer often becomes easier in these quiet spaces. Reflection becomes deeper. Instead of reacting to endless external stimulation, a person becomes present with their inner life again. This does not require hours of isolation every day. Sometimes, even a few intentional minutes can make a difference. Moments where devices are put aside. Moments where attention is focused not on information, but on connection with God. Over time, these small moments begin rebuilding the spiritual foundation that distraction once weakened. Another important way to protect faith is by facing doubts honestly. As we discussed earlier, doubt itself is not the enemy. The danger appears when doubt is hidden, when questions remain buried and unspoken. But when someone is willing to explore their questions openly, something important changes. Curiosity replaces fear. Learning replaces uncertainty. Instead of allowing doubts to quietly grow in isolation, a person begins seeking wisdom. They read, they study, they listen to others who have wrestled with similar questions. And often, through that process, their faith becomes stronger than it was before. Not because every question receives a perfect answer, but because their faith becomes deeper and more thoughtful. Mature faith is rarely built on blind certainty. It is built on trust that has been tested, explored, and strengthened through experience. Facing doubts honestly allows that kind of mature faith to grow. A third important step in protecting faith is reconnecting with spiritual community. Isolation can slowly weaken belief, but connection has the power to strengthen it again. When believers support each other, something powerful happens. They remind each other of hope during difficult moments. They share experiences that deepen understanding. They encourage one another when faith feels fragile. Even simple conversations about life and belief can make a difference. Sometimes hearing another person's story restores courage. Sometimes witnessing someone else's faith during hardship becomes a powerful reminder that belief can endure even in the most challenging seasons. Spiritual community also creates accountability, not in a way that controls or pressures people, but in a way that encourages growth. When people know that others care about their spiritual journey, they are more likely to remain committed to practices that strengthen their faith. Community reminds us that faith is not only a private belief, but also part of a shared journey. Another way faith grows stronger is through gratitude. Gratitude changes how people see the world. Instead of focusing only on problems or disappointments, gratitude trains the mind to recognize blessings that often go unnoticed. Even during difficult seasons, moments of goodness still exist. Small acts of kindness, unexpected encouragement, opportunities for growth. When someone regularly reflects on these moments, their perspective begins changing. Hope becomes easier to see. Faith becomes easier to hold on to. Gratitude does not eliminate life's challenges, but it shifts attention toward the ways God continues working even in the middle of those challenges. Over time, this perspective strengthens trust. Finally, protecting faith often requires patience. Spiritual growth is not always dramatic. There are seasons when faith feels vibrant and alive. But there are also seasons when it feels quieter, less emotional, less intense. During those times, some people mistakenly believe something is wrong. They assume their faith has disappeared. But often, what they are experiencing is simply a quieter season of spiritual life. Faith, like many meaningful relationships, moves through different seasons. Moments of excitement, moments of reflection, moments of deep questioning, and moments of quiet trust. Remaining faithful through all of these seasons is part of what strengthens belief over time. Faith that survives challenges often becomes stronger than faith that was never tested, because it has learned to endure, to trust, to remain steady even when emotions change. When someone practices these simple habits, creating quiet space, exploring doubts honestly, reconnecting with community, cultivating gratitude, and practicing patience, their faith begins growing stronger again. Not overnight, but gradually. Just as faith can slowly fade through neglect, it can also slowly grow through intentional care. Each small step strengthens the connection. Each moment of attention rebuilds what once felt distant. And over time, faith becomes something alive again. Not just a belief someone once held, but a living relationship that continues shaping the way they see the world. When people think about losing faith, they often imagine something dramatic. A moment of anger, a painful tragedy, a sudden rejection of belief. But as we have seen, faith rarely disappears that way. More often, it fades quietly. Not because someone suddenly stopped believing, but because small forces slowly began pulling their attention away. Distraction filled their days. Doubt remained unspoken in their minds. Isolation quietly separated them from encouragement and community. None of these things seem powerful at first. Each one appears small, harmless, almost invisible. But over time, they slowly reshape the spiritual life of a person. Like water slowly wearing down stone, the process is gradual. So gradual that many people do not notice the change until much later. They look back and realize something that once felt alive inside them now feels distant. Something that once brought clarity now feels uncertain. And sometimes that realization can feel discouraging. It can feel like faith has been lost forever. But the truth is far more hopeful than that. Faith is not as fragile as many people think. Even when it feels weak, the desire for faith often still exists deep within the heart. That quiet desire to believe, that longing for meaning, that sense that life must hold something greater than what we see on the surface. Those desires do not disappear easily. In fact, they are often signs that faith is still present, even if it feels distant. The important thing to remember is that faith grows in the same way it fades. Gradually, through small moments, through quiet choices. Just as faith can weaken through distraction, it can grow through intentional attention. When someone chooses to create space for reflection again, spiritual awareness begins returning. When someone chooses to face their doubts honestly instead of hiding them, understanding begins growing. When someone reconnects with others who share their faith journey, encouragement begins restoring strength. These changes may not feel dramatic at first. There may not be a sudden moment where everything becomes clear again, but something subtle begins happening. Little by little, the connection returns. The heart begins opening again. Hope begins growing again. And slowly, faith becomes alive once more. This is one of the most beautiful truths about faith. It is resilient. It can survive seasons of silence. It can survive seasons of doubt. It can even survive seasons where someone feels distant from everything they once believed. Because faith is not just about feelings. Feelings come and go. Faith is about trust. And trust can grow even during the quietest seasons of life. There may be moments when faith feels strong and confident. Moments where belief feels natural and effortless. But there will also be seasons where faith feels quieter, less emotional, more reflective. Those seasons do not mean faith has disappeared. Often, they are simply part of the journey. Every meaningful relationship moves through seasons. Moments of excitement, moments of challenge, moments of deep reflection. Faith is no different. The important thing is not expecting faith to always feel the same. The important thing is continuing the journey even when it feels quiet. Because sometimes the strongest faith is the kind that continues walking forward even when the path feels uncertain. Even when answers are incomplete. Even when life raises difficult questions. Faith does not require perfect certainty. It requires a willingness to keep seeking, to keep trusting, to keep moving forward. And the good news is this. If you recognize the quiet forces that can weaken faith, you now have the power to guard against them. You can choose moments of silence in a noisy world. You can bring your questions into the light instead of hiding them. You can seek community instead of carrying your struggles alone. Each of these choices strengthens faith in ways that may not always be visible immediately. But over time, they shape the direction of your spiritual life. They rebuild the foundation that faith stands on. And eventually, something beautiful begins to happen. The faith that once felt distant begins feeling real again, alive again, not because life has become easy, but because you have learned how to protect what matters most. So if your faith has ever felt weaker than it once did, remember this. Faith rarely disappears overnight. And because of that, it can always begin growing again one small step at a time. The question is not whether challenges will come. They always will. The question is whether you will continue choosing to nurture your faith through those challenges. Because when faith is cared for, protected, and nourished over time, it becomes something incredibly strong. Something that can endure uncertainty. Something that can survive hardship. Something that can continue guiding your life no matter what season you are walking through. And that kind of faith is not easily destroyed. It becomes the quiet strength that carries you forward.